Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I buried my only son, Peter, on a gray morning in Boston, thinking the worst pain of my life had already passed. But that same day, his widow told me I had no place in the house where I had rocked my grandchildren to sleep. I slept in my old car, aching and unseen, until the day a courtroom played Peter's secret recording. In his own voice, he revealed the $5 million truth that turned grief into justice. The church bells had only just stopped ringing when I felt my knees weaken under the weight of grief. My son Peter was gone. At 38, he had fought hard against the cancer that stole him from us, and now I stood surrounded by flowers that already smelled too sweet, cloying, as if they wanted to mask the reality of death. My hands trembled as I held on to Emma's small palm. She was only 9, her dress wrinkled from twisting it nervously. Beside her, James stood stiff and silent, 11 years old, trying to look braver than he felt. His father's photograph sat at the front of the chapel, framed in black ribbon, and every time I looked at it, I felt a hollow tear through my chest. We made our way back to the house in Brookline, a quiet neighborhood just outside Boston where Peter had built a life for his family. The rooms were crowded with mourners, neighbors, colleagues, friends who wanted to say kind words and press my hand. I nodded and thanked them, but their voices sounded far away. My world had shrunk to the children clinging to me, the photographs on the wall, and the aching silence of knowing my son would never walk through that door again. Melissa moved easily among the guests, dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, her blonde hair swept neatly back. She smiled at the right moments, her voice soft, thanking everyone for coming. To the outside world, she looked like the perfect grieving widow. I wanted to believe her warmth was real, that perhaps in our shared loss, we might find some way to lean on each other. For a moment, as she guided Emma to hug one of Peter's colleagues, I thought I saw a flicker of compassion in her eyes, but it disappeared before I could be sure. When the last guest trickled out and the front door clicked shut, the house grew still. I busied myself in the kitchen stacking plates and glasses, anything to keep from collapsing. Melissa entered, heels clicking on the hardwood, and set her glass down with a sharp clatter. She stood with her arms folded, watching me. There was no trace of the softness she had worn in public. Her face was tight, impatient. "You always do this, Evelyn," she said coldly. "Always crying, always clinging to the children. It is not good for them to see you like this. They need stability." I turned slowly, my hands still damp from the sink. I had spent weeks preparing for this day, trying to hold myself together, and her words cut deeper than any knife. "These children just lost their father," I whispered. "They need all the love they can get." She shook her head and stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "Peter is gone, and things have to change. This is my house now. Emma and James are my responsibility. You staying here is not helping." My heart thudded. Peter had asked me to be here to help. Before the cancer worsened, he had said he wanted me close, that the children would need me. My voice wavered, but I forced the words out. "Peter wanted me here, Melissa. He told me himself." Melissa gave a small laugh without warmth. "Peter said many things when he was sick and not thinking clearly. The reality is that I cannot do this with you here." I gripped the counter to steady myself. "I have nowhere to go. My apartment was sold years ago when Peter asked me to move in and help after Emma was born. This is my home too." Melissa's eyes hardened. "No, Evelyn, this is my home. You need to pack your things. I want you out by tomorrow evening." The room spun. I could hardly breathe. Only hours earlier we had laid my son to rest, and now his wife was telling me to leave the house where I had cooked meals, read bedtime stories, and kissed scraped knees for nearly a decade. Please at least give me a little more time, I begged, my voice breaking. Just a week. I need to find somewhere safe. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse and glanced at her reflection in the glass door. Tomorrow, Evelyn. The decorators are coming to look at Peter's office. I will not have you here making things awkward. I felt the strength drain from me. For 5 years, I had devoted myself to this household, cooking dinners when Melissa traveled, staying up with the children when they were sick, keeping the family steady while Peter worked long hours. None of it mattered now. She looked at me as if I were a burden, something to be discarded. I nodded slowly, unable to trust my voice. The cardigan I wore still carried the faint scent of Peter's cologne, and in that moment it was all I had left. Melissa's words echoed in the silence. Pack your things. Tomorrow. The house felt colder than the winter air outside. Emma and James were upstairs, finally asleep after a long, exhausting day. I pressed my hand to the stair railing, torn between waking them for one last embrace or sparing them the confusion. In the end, I let the quiet remain my heart, heavy with a grief that now carried another weight, the fear of losing not just my son, but the only family I had left. I stood there in the dim hallway, the shadows stretching long across the floor, realizing that tomorrow everything I had known would be gone. My throat tightened as I tried to speak, but the words caught somewhere between grief and disbelief. I managed only a whisper, asking Melissa if she truly meant to send me away so soon. She looked at me steadily, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then with a sharp breath she repeated that this was her home, not mine, and that by tomorrow evening I needed to be gone. The certainty in her voice left no room for discussion. It felt as if the walls of the house, the same walls where I had once sung lullabies and tucked in 2 sleepy children, had suddenly closed in around me. I clutched the banister for support, dizzy at the thought of losing not just Peter, but also the life we had built here together. I tried again, this time with more urgency. Melissa, please, Peter wanted me here. He said himself that Emma and James would need me. I promised him I would not leave them. My voice cracked and my eyes burned. She tilted her head and gave a small laugh that chilled me. He was sick, Evelyn. He said all kinds of things. That does not mean he expected you to live here forever. Her dismissal cut me deeper than I could bear. I raised my voice, though it shook. I sold my own apartment so I could be here for them. I gave up everything. Where do you expect me to go? Melissa shrugged almost casually, as if my life were a detail she had no reason to consider. That is not my concern. By tomorrow, Evelyn, do not make this harder than it has to be. I stared at her, desperate, but the conversation was already over for her. She turned away, carrying her glass back to the kitchen, humming softly, as if she had already moved on. The children stirred upstairs, and the sound of Emma's laugh in her sleep drifted down the hall. I wanted to cling to that moment, to believe that family ties could not be severed so coldly. But Melissa's words hung heavy in the air, final and unyielding. That night I sat at the small desk in the guest room, the room Peter had painted pale yellow when I first moved in. I found a notepad in the drawer, its pages crisp and unused, and I began to write. The words came slowly at first. My dearest Emma and James. I began, my hand trembling as I tried to steady the pen. I told them I loved them more than anything, that none of what was happening was their fault, that if I was not here when they woke, it was only because I was asked to leave, not because I wanted to. I promised I would always be near in spirit, that I would find a way back to them. When I finished, I folded the note and slipped it between the pages of their favorite bedtime book, the one Peter used to read to them every night. I prayed that someday they would find it and know the truth. Packing felt like dismantling pieces of my soul. I folded each blouse and sweater, carefully remembering where I had worn them. The blue cardigan I wore when Peter took the children apple picking. The warm scarf Emma once borrowed for a school play. Each item seemed to carry echoes of laughter and voices that now slipped through my fingers like smoke. I placed them gently into the old brown suitcase, the one Peter had once used on business trips. Its zipper caught halfway, and I tugged at it until it finally closed with a sound that felt far too final. I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled creaks of the house settling for the night. Every sound reminded me of the years I had lived here, of nights, waiting up for Peter to come home late from work, of mornings, making pancakes for Emma and James before school. Around 3 a.m, I heard Melissa's footsteps in the hallway and the door of her bedroom closing firmly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the darkest storm. When dawn finally crept across the sky, pale light seeping through the blinds, I rose and smoothed the bedspread one last time. I carried the suitcase down the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat. In the living room, the family photographs still lined the mantel, but I knew they would not remain. Soon Melissa would take them down, perhaps replace them with something glossy and new, erasing all trace of Peter's past. I let my fingers brush over the frame of Peter's college graduation photo, tracing the outline of his smile. As I turned toward the door, Melissa appeared with her coffee cup steam curling into the morning air. She was dressed already as if prepared for a day of errands, her expression calm and unwavering. She said nothing, only watched as I lifted the handle of my suitcase. I could feel her eyes on me, steady and cold, a reminder that this moment was exactly what she had wanted. I stepped outside, the early spring air brisk and unforgiving. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of Sunday morning hush that usually brought peace. Today it only magnified the emptiness inside me. I walked slowly to my old sedan parked at the curb, the car that had carried groceries and soccer gear and countless memories over the years. Its paint was chipped, the windshield slightly cracked, but it started with a familiar rattle that felt like the last constant in my life. I placed the suitcase on the passenger seat and sat for a long moment staring back at the house. Through the window, I could see the faint movement of curtains, Melissa watching with her cup in hand. Upstairs, Emma and James slept peacefully, unaware that their grandmother had been forced out of their lives overnight. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. Finally, I gripped the steering wheel, my hands pale against the worn leather, and turned the key. The engine roared louder than usual in the still morning air. I put the car in gear, the tires crunching softly on the asphalt, and began to drive. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, shrinking into the distance until it was just another outline among the rows of suburban homes. I whispered a promise under my breath, barely audible even to myself. I will come back for you, Peter. And I will come back for the children. I will not let this be the end. As the road opened before me, lined with budding trees and quiet sidewalks, I drove into the uncertainty of a future I had never imagined. Behind me, the house and the life I once knew disappeared, sealed away as if it had never been mine at all. Ahead lay only questions, loneliness, and the faint fragile hope that love might somehow guide me back. The first night in my car felt like falling into a world that no longer belonged to me. I parked behind a quiet church on the edge of Boston, its parking lot empty except for my old sedan. I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go, but no matter how I shifted my legs, there was no comfort. My knees ached, my neck stiffened, and every small sound outside made me sit up in fear. By dawn, I had not slept more than a few scattered minutes. In the morning, I washed my face in the church restroom, avoiding the mirror as much as I could. The fluorescent light was cruel. I looked at the wrinkles etched deeper from sleeplessness at the shadows beneath my eyes, and for the first time, I wondered if Emma and James would even recognize me if they saw me. My reflection felt like that of a stranger. I tried to stretch in the parking lot, rolling my shoulders to ease the soreness that settled into my bones. Breakfast was 2 slices of bread with a thin spread of peanut butter eaten carefully to make the jar last. The taste usually a comfort turned dry in my mouth, almost bitter when I thought of how I used to pack sandwiches for the kids' lunches. For the next few days, I created a rhythm of survival. In the mornings, I used the church restroom or sometimes a gas station sink to clean myself as best I could. I kept a toothbrush and a small bar of soap tucked into a plastic bag, pulling them out with a kind of ritual. I ate little, stretching a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a pack of crackers across an entire week. At night, I curled into myself in the driver's seat, shivering when the temperature dropped, sweating when the air turned heavy and warm. I set up a P.O. box at the post office downtown. The small key was all I had to anchor myself to the world of the living, a way to prove that I still existed, even without an address to call my own. I checked it each day, though most days it was empty. On the rare occasion I found a piece of mail addressed to me, even if it was a utility notice, it reminded me that I was still someone not entirely erased. 3 weeks blurred together. I drove often past the school where Emma and James studied. I would park across the street, careful to stay back far enough that I would not be noticed. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of them during recess, their small figures running in the yard, laughter carrying faintly even through the closed windows of my car. Emma's ponytail bounced as she skipped rope. James played catch with another boy. The sight filled me with both joy and despair. Joy that they seemed, well, despair that I was no longer part of their daily lives. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel so I would not rush across the street, gather them in my arms, and ruin everything by creating a scene. One afternoon, I ventured into a supermarket to buy another loaf of bread. I pushed the cart slowly, clutching my thin wallet in one hand. As I reached for a jar of peanut butter, I heard a familiar voice. Margaret, an old neighbor, was standing just a few feet away. We had shared coffee countless times, exchanged Christmas cookies, laughed about the antics of our children. I opened my mouth to greet her, but when her eyes landed on me, she hesitated. Her smile faltered, and after a moment she looked past me as if I were invisible. She turned her cart sharply down another aisle, pretending she had not seen me. The sting of that moment burned worse than hunger. I left quickly, my heart pounding, the jar of peanut butter heavy in my hand. Outside, I sat in my car and cried silently, shoulders shaking as I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel. I must have looked like every other person living on the edge, too ragged to acknowledge, too fragile to carry into polite conversation. The physical pain grew worse with each passing night. My hips ached from curling on the stiff seat. My back screamed when I tried to stretch in the morning. Some nights I woke with cramps in my legs so sharp I had to step out of the car and walk in circles around the parking lot until they passed. I had lost weight. I could not afford to lose my clothes, hanging looser with each week. But the worst pain was not in my body. It was in the slow crumbling of my spirit. Each time I caught sight of Emma and James, I longed to reach them to assure them that I had not abandoned them. Each time I thought of Peter, my chest tightened with guilt that I had failed to keep my promise to stay close to his children. The note I had left hidden in their book seemed like a weak substitute for the warmth I had once given them every day. At night, I whispered prayers into the silence, prayers that someone would see me, that somehow I would be allowed to step back into the life I had lost. But the only response was the hum of traffic in the distance and the rustle of branches in the wind. One morning after another sleepless night, I watched the sunrise paint the Boston skyline in pale gold. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest spark of determination. I could not let this be the end of my story. I owed Peter more than that. I owed Emma and James more than that. I placed my hand on the cracked steering wheel and whispered again, this time more firmly, "I will find a way." I sat in the corner of the public library, the computer screen glowing faintly against the dim afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows. My hands hovered uncertainly over the keyboard as I logged into the only social media account I still remembered the password for. The screen loaded slowly, and then there it was, Melissa's newest post. A wide photograph stretched across the page, a living room I knew too well, though now it looked nothing like the home Peter had built. The walls were painted a sharp white. The furniture gleamed in chrome and glass, every trace of warmth stripped away. Beneath it, she had written clear, the old to welcome the new. Feeling grateful, the comments scrolled endlessly, words of admiration from her friends, compliments on her strength, her courage, her resilience. One sentence pierced me like a knife. Someone had written that Peter would be proud of her for moving on so well. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the sob that rose up before I could stop it. My chest heaved, and tears blurred the words on the screen. It felt like he was being erased in real time, like the man I had loved and raised, the father who had adored his children, was being swept out of existence while the world applauded. I shut the computer down and stumbled outside, the sharp spring air hitting my damp cheeks. My hand shook as I gripped the steering wheel of my car. I drove without knowing where, my heart pulling me back to the house I no longer belonged to. As I turned onto the street, my stomach clenched. A large dumpster stood in the driveway, towering like an ugly monument. From the road, I could see the contents spilling over the edge. Peter's desk, the one where he had sat to help James with math homework, and Emma with spelling words, lay cracked at an angle. The recliner where he used to doze with the children on Sunday afternoons was thrown on top like garbage. I could see boxes crushed beneath the weight book scattered, and even a framed photo face down on the heap. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the car to the curb a half block away, afraid to get closer, afraid Melissa would see me standing there. But I could not tear my eyes from the sight. Two men carried out more furniture, laughing between themselves as they tossed each piece with careless ease. Melissa stood nearby in athletic clothes, a phone at her ear, gesturing with her free hand, as though she were directing a moving crew instead of discarding the life my son had built. I wrapped my arms around myself and felt my body tremble. The image of her tossing Peter's memories into a dumpster seared itself into my mind. I drove off before my tears blurred the road completely. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I pulled into an empty parking lot to calm myself. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to breathe through the ache in my chest. How could she erase him so easily, so quickly, like he had never mattered? How could the children grow up in a house stripped of every reminder of their father? That night, parked behind the diner where I sometimes found refuge, I curled up in the driver's seat, my face pressed into my jacket sleeve. I let myself cry in great racking sobs that shook my body. For the first time since I left the house, I allowed all of it to come out. I cried for Peter, for the children, for myself, for the cruel truth that 5 years of giving everything I had to that family could be discarded like old furniture. My tears finally slowed exhaustion, pulling me under into a fitful sleep. Some time later, the sharp trill of my phone jolted me awake. The cracked screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake or some debt collector, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out. But something stirred in me a sense that I should not ignore it. I slid my finger across the screen and croaked a greeting, my voice raw. "Mrs. Parker," the man's voice said, calm and professional. "This is Richard Chen. I was your son, Peter's attorney. I have been trying to reach you." My pulse quickened and I sat up straighter, though my body still ached. He explained that there were urgent matters regarding Peter's estate, and that he needed to see me in his office as soon as possible. For a long moment I could not answer. My mind spun with disbelief. Estate attorney matters that concerned me. I clutched the phone tighter. Melissa has handled everything, I managed to say, my voice thin. Mr. Chen paused. "There are provisions in Peter's will that directly involve you, provisions that Mrs. Parker is not aware of." His words hung in the air, a spark in the darkness I had been drowning in. He asked if I could come to his office the next morning. I looked around at my car, at the crumpled blanket and the half-empty jar of peanut butter on the passenger seat. Shame washed over me, but his voice was steady, assuring me that it was important and that I should come as I was. I agreed, hardly understanding how my life had shifted in the space of a few minutes. When the call ended, I sat for a long time in the stillness of the night, the sound of distant traffic humming in the background. For weeks, I had been invisible, discarded, surviving in the shadows. And now suddenly, there was a thread of possibility, a reminder that perhaps Peter had not left me as unprotected as Melissa wanted me to believe. I pressed the phone to my chest and whispered his name, letting the faintest hope flicker through me for the first time in weeks. His voice carried a calm authority that immediately steadied me, even as I sat curled in the driver's seat of my old sedan with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. He explained that he had been Peter's attorney and that there were matters regarding my son's estate that required my immediate attention. My instinct was to shrink back, to admit that I had no place in any of this, but before I could speak, he added gently that Peter had made specific provisions for me. I hesitated, my throat dry, and finally whispered that I was not sure I could come to his office. When he asked why, the truth tumbled out before I could stop it. "I am living in my car, Mr. Chen. I do not look presentable. I do not want to embarrass Peter's memory." There was a pause, and I braced for pity or judgment. Instead, his voice was firm and reassuring. "Mrs. Parker, please come as you are. This is important. Your son was very deliberate about this, and I believe it will change things for you." The next morning, I drove to downtown Boston, my heart hammering, as I followed the directions he had given me. The Morrison building rose high above the street, all glass and steel, a stark contrast to the dingy parking lots I had been hiding in. I smoothed my wrinkled blouse as best I could and walked into the marble lobby, my shoes echoing against the polished floor. I felt small and out of place, but the receptionist smiled kindly and directed me upstairs. Richard Chen's office was unlike anything I had seen in weeks. The carpets were thick and silent, beneath my feet the air warm and faintly scented with coffee. He came forward to greet me, a man in his 50s, with calm eyes and wire-rimmed glasses. He extended his hand and guided me to a leather chair. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked. I nodded quickly, my throat tightening again. When the steaming cup was placed before me, I wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat seep into my chilled fingers. The first sip nearly undid me. It was the first real coffee I had tasted since I left the house, rich and strong, nothing like the watery diner brew I had been nursing. Tears pricked my eyes, and I quickly blinked them away embarrassed, but Richard's expression was nothing but understanding. He opened a thick folder on his desk and looked at me with careful seriousness. "Before we go further, I need to ask something personal. What is your current living situation?" My cheeks burned as I admitted that I had been staying in my car. He did not flinch. Instead, he wrote a note and said softly, "Peter thought this might happen. That is why he came to me months ago with very clear instructions." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the coffee cup so tightly I feared it would break. "What do you mean?" Richard adjusted his glasses and began to read. "To my mother, Evelyn Parker, who gave her life to caring for me and my children, I leave $5 million to be held in trust and managed until she can establish stable housing and financial security." The words echoed in my ears, almost impossible to process. I shook my head. $5 million? That cannot be right. Richard's expression did not waver. "Your son was very successful. He had investments, insurance, and assets most people never knew about. He wanted to ensure you were protected." My breath came in short bursts. I had been eating crackers and peanut butter for weeks, yet Peter had left me a future I never imagined. But Richard was not finished. "There is another provision, one that may be even more important." He flipped to a second document. "In the event that Melissa Parker attempts to remove my mother from the family home or restrict her access to the children, full custody of Emma and James shall transfer to my mother with all financial support provided through the trust." My hand flew to my mouth. "Custody." I whispered the word aloud, stunned. He nodded. Peter anticipated the possibility. He documented conversations, concerns, even sought legal advice to make sure it was binding. He wanted his children with you if Melissa failed to honor his wishes. I sat frozen in the room, spinning slowly. My son, even in his final months, had been thinking of me, of his children, of a way to protect us all. Richard slid an envelope across the desk. "There is also a letter he wrote for you. Would you like me to read it aloud, or do you prefer to read it privately?" My hands shook so badly I could not imagine holding the paper. "Please read it," I whispered. Richard unfolded the letter and began, "Mom, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and my fears about Melissa have come true. I am sorry I could not warn you more directly. I know she may have told you that you are unwanted, but you are the heart of this family. I am leaving you not just money, but the means to protect Emma and James. Do not doubt yourself. They need you." The words broke something open in me. Tears ran freely down my face, and I did not try to hide them. I felt Peter's voice reaching across the distance, steady and loving, reminding me that I was not disposable, that I still had a purpose. When the letter ended, Richard gave me time to collect myself. Then he spoke again, practical and calm. "Tonight you will not sleep in your car. I will arrange for you to stay at a hotel until we can secure something more permanent. Tomorrow we will begin the custody filing. Peter's provisions give us strong ground, but we must move carefully." I nodded, still dazed. The thought of sleeping in a real bed, of showering without rushing in a public restroom, seemed like an unimaginable luxury. But more than that, the idea that I could protect my grandchildren, that I could keep Peter's memory alive for them, filled me with a strength I thought I had lost. As I left his office, the city outside looked different. The same streets, the same cars, but no longer gray and indifferent. I clutched the envelope with Peter's letter pressed against my chest. For the first time in weeks, I walked with my head lifted, carrying not just grief, but also the fragile spark of hope he had left for me. Richard slid another envelope across the polished desk, its edges worn from being handled with care. My breath caught as I reached for it, my fingers trembling against the paper. I recognized Peter's handwriting immediately, the familiar slant of his letters, the way he always pressed a little too hard with the pen. My throat tightened, and for a moment I could not bring myself to break the seal. Richard offered gently to read it for me, but I shook my head. I needed to see the words with my own eyes. I unfolded the pages slowly, afraid they might tear under my shaking hands. At the top in Peter's strong but fading script was my name. Mom. The word blurred as tears welled, and I forced myself to blink until I could focus again. He began with an apology, telling me how sorry he was that he could not be fully honest while he was alive. He admitted that the cancer had stolen not just his strength, but also his courage to face what he feared most, that Melissa might turn the children against me if she knew what he was planning. He wrote that he had chosen silence to protect the bond between me and Emma and James for as long as possible. I read on my heart aching with every line. He called me the one person he trusted completely, the one who had always been there through every struggle. He said that when he thought about the future of his children, the image that gave him peace was me sitting with them at the kitchen table, guiding them with patience and love. Then the letter shifted. He explained that in the final months when Melissa believed he was too weak to notice, he had started recording their conversations. He wrote that he needed evidence, something undeniable, because he knew words alone might not be enough. My hands shook as I traced the lines where he described her cold statements. She had spoken of starting over in California, of how she could not bear to have me around after he was gone, of how the children would adapt faster without me as a reminder of their father. He admitted how much it hurt him to hear those things, how each word cut deeper than the disease that was killing him, but he endured it to protect the children. He had given the recordings to Richard, instructing him to use them if Melissa ever tried to push me away. The next lines made me press my hand to my chest. Mom, you are the only anchor they will have. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. You are the safe place for Emma and James, and they need that more than anything money can buy. You are not a burden. You are their home. I could hardly see the page through my tears. My voice broke in the quiet office as I whispered his words back to myself. You are their home. For weeks I had believed I was nothing, discarded, forgotten. Yet here was proof in his own handwriting that he had trusted me more than anyone else in the world. I felt Richard's steady presence across the desk, waiting without interruption until I was ready. When I lowered the letter, my hands still shaking, he nodded toward a small digital recorder. Peter gave me these files, he explained softly. They will be essential if we need to defend your guardianship in court. He wanted you to know he did everything he could to prepare. The thought of hearing Melissa's voice, cold and dismissive, made my stomach twist, but the knowledge that Peter had armed me with the truth filled me with something I had not felt in weeks. Hope. I sat back, pressing the letter against my chest, as though holding it close could bring Peter back for a moment. The tears still flowed, but they felt different now. They were not just grief, but a strange mixture of sorrow and strength. My son had not abandoned me. He had believed in me, trusted me, and left me with the tools to fight for his children. Richard poured me another cup of coffee and let the silence settle between us until I found my voice again. "Thank you," I whispered, though I knew the words were far too small for the weight of what Peter had given me. That night, in the quiet of the hotel room Richard had arranged, I read the letter again and again, the words etched deeper each time. I traced Peter's handwriting with my finger, hearing his voice in my mind, steady and certain. For the first time since I had left the house with my suitcase, I felt the faint stirrings of purpose. I placed the letter carefully in the drawer beside the bed, knowing I would keep it close for the rest of my life. As I turned off the light, I lay back on the soft pillow, my body still sore from weeks in the car, but my spirit steadier. The memory of the dumpster of Melissa's laughter as Peter's belongings were thrown away still haunted me, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that she had not won. Peter had seen her clearly, and he had chosen me. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark. "I will not fail you, Peter. I will protect them." The following days moved quickly, almost too quickly for me to grasp. Richard assured me that he and his associate had already filed the petition with the Boston Family Court, and hearing those words left me both relieved and terrified. I had never set foot in a courtroom except for jury duty decades ago, yet now my future and the future of Emma and James were tied to one. Richard explained carefully, his tone calm and steady, that Peter's will was strong enough to form the backbone of the case. Still, he warned that Melissa would fight back with everything she had. His prediction proved true. Within days, Melissa was served the documents, and her fury did not take long to reach me. She hired a lawyer named Eric Sanders, a man whose reputation preceded him. Richard described him as shrewd, relentless, and willing to use any tactic to sway the court. I pictured Melissa walking into Sanders's office with her designer coat and carefully rehearsed tears spinning the story until she became the grieving widow, struggling to protect her children from an overbearing grandmother. The thought of sitting across from them in court made my stomach tighten until I felt sick. The anxiety clung to me until one evening the hotel phone rang. I almost did not answer, assuming it was the front desk, but when I picked up, a woman's voice filled the line. She introduced herself as Melissa's sister. I had spoken to her only briefly at the funeral, where she had offered me a perfunctory hug before turning her attention to Melissa. Now her words were smooth, almost casual, but underneath I heard the warning. She told me that Melissa was considering moving back to California, closer to her, where she could start fresh with the children. She painted it as a positive change, a new life where Emma and James could forget the sadness of losing their father. I felt cold all over. California was 3,000 miles away. If they left, I would never see them again, except perhaps on holidays if Melissa even allowed that. I tried to respond calmly, saying that Peter had left instructions, but she cut me off with a laugh that felt like a slap. "Evelyn, you are old and tired. Let Melissa raise her kids the way she wants." Then the line went dead. I sat frozen, the dial tone humming in my ear until I finally hung up. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with images of Emma and James at a new school, walking along palm trees with no trace of Boston winters, their father's memory fading into the background as Melissa built a shiny new life. The fear gripped me harder than hunger or exhaustion ever had. The next morning, Richard arranged for a social worker to visit me. Her name was Karen Douglas, and when she knocked on the hotel room door, I braced myself. She was polite, professional, and carried a clipboard that seemed to weigh as much as a judgment. She asked if she could look around, so I guided her through the suite, apologizing that it was temporary. She made notes without comment, though. I saw her glance at the small bag of groceries in the kitchenette and the neat pile of folded clothes I had bought with the allowance Richard provided. Karen asked questions methodically. How was my health? Could I keep up with 2 active children? Did I have plans for permanent housing? Did I understand the responsibilities of guardianship? Each question felt like a spotlight shining on my inadequacies, but I answered as honestly as I could. I told her about raising Peter as a single mother after my husband died, about helping Emma and James with their homework every night for years, about cooking dinners and caring for them when Melissa traveled. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, fueled by memories of bedtime stories and soccer practices of scraped knees kissed better and school projects built together at the kitchen table. Karen listened quietly, jotting notes. Then she set her pen down and looked directly at me. Mrs. Parker, I believe you love your grandchildren deeply, but the court needs more than love. To grant custody, you will need strong evidence that the children are safer and more stable with you than with their mother. Love alone will not be enough. Her words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. For a moment, my resolve faltered. What evidence did I have besides the bruises on my heart and the memories of Melissa's dismissive cruelty? I lowered my eyes, shame and fear washing over me. Then, like a light flickering on in the darkness, I remembered what Peter had written in his letter, the recordings. He had not just left me words of love. He had left proof, undeniable proof of what Melissa had said when she thought no one was listening. My pulse quickened as the memory grew clearer. Richard had them. Peter had planned for this. I lifted my gaze to Karen and nodded slowly. I understand. I will have what you need. When she left, I sank onto the bed, clutching Peter's letter in my lap. For weeks I had been invisible, surviving in silence, but now I could see the path forward. Peter had given me the means to fight. The fear of Melissa's threats and Eric Sanders's sharp tongue still lingered, but beneath it all was something stronger. For the first time, I felt not just hope, but determination. I would not let Melissa carry them away. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the hotel room, the faint hum of city traffic outside. I thought of Emma's laugh, of James's serious questions about the stars, of Peter's smile when he saw me reading to them. I whispered to the dark that I would protect them, that I would not let Peter's trust be wasted. And with that promise, I finally closed my eyes, ready for the battles ahead. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of scent that clung to history and judgment. I sat on the bench beside Richard, clutching the folder he had prepared for me, though my palms were so damp the edges had begun to curl. Across the room, Melissa adjusted the cuff of her navy blazer, her expression a polished mask of grief and dignity. Her lawyer, Eric Sanders, leaned in to whisper something to her, his confident smirk twisting my stomach into knots. The judge called the case, his voice echoing against the high ceiling. I felt the weight of the room pressing down, every glance, every whisper reminding me that this was not just about me. It was about Emma and James, their future, their safety, their chance to grow up remembering who their father truly was. Richard began by calling our first witness. My sister-in-law, Linda Parker, stood nervously at the podium. She pushed her glasses up her nose and cleared her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. But her words were steady, filled with memories that felt as vivid as my own. She told the court how I had been the one caring for Emma and James when Peter and Melissa worked late, how she had seen me arrive at school events even when Melissa was away, how I had cooked meals and sat through fevers and scraped knees. She said plainly that I was not just a grandmother. I had been their daily caretaker. I watched Melissa's face remain smooth, her eyes blinking slowly as if none of it mattered. But I saw a flicker in the judge's eyes, a quiet acknowledgement as he scribbled notes. Then Richard called Chloe Smith Peter's closest friend since college. She carried a folder of printed emails, her voice calm but firm as she read aloud. In those messages, Peter had confided his fears, writing that Melissa was growing colder by the day, that he worried she would push me aside once he was gone. In one email, he wrote, "If Mom is not there, I don't know who will hold the kids together." My heart clenched at those words, hearing my son's voice through the lines of text. Chloe explained that Peter had trusted me to provide the love and steadiness he feared Melissa could not. When the neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, stepped forward, her testimony was simple but powerful. She spoke of the countless mornings she had seen me holding Emma's hand as they walked to school of afternoons when I brought James to soccer practice. She described how the children always looked to me first when something happened, whether it was a scraped knee or a forgotten lunch. Her words painted the picture of a home where I had been the constant, the one who filled in the gaps. For a moment, I let myself breathe just slightly, believing that maybe, just maybe, the court was beginning to see what Peter had known all along. But then Eric Sanders rose. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, his tone deceptively warm. He began by acknowledging my love for the children, which only made the blade he held sharper. Then he pivoted, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He painted a picture of me not as a steady grandmother, but as a woman unraveling. He told the court about how I had been found living in my car, sleeping in parking lots, washing in public restrooms. He leaned on every word, each pause heavy with suggestion. If she cannot maintain stability for herself, how can she possibly provide stability for 2 young children? His voice rang with finality. The words hit like stones. I could feel the eyes of the courtroom turning toward me, weighing me, judging me. My cheeks burned. Images flooded back the cracked leather of the driver's seat, the way my body ached from curling into myself at night, the humiliation of neighbors averting their gaze. I tried to form words, but my throat closed tight. Melissa shifted slightly, just enough for me to see the small, satisfied curve of her lips. She thought it was finished. She thought Eric's words had buried me. The judge glanced down at his notes, his brow furrowed. He asked if I had a response. My lips parted, but the shame rose like a wall. All I could whisper was that I had done what I could to survive. My voice was too soft, almost swallowed by the silence of the room. Eric pressed further, his tone smooth, but laced with venom. "Love is admirable, Your Honor, but children need a roof stability consistency, not car seats and gas station sinks." He stepped back then, his eyes locking on mine for a brief, victorious moment before he returned to his table. I gripped the edge of the bench so tightly my knuckles whitened. I thought of Emma's soft voice asking if I was real when she saw me last, of James's questions about why I had disappeared. My shame was deep, but beneath it burned something stronger. Peter had known Melissa would try this. He had known she would twist my hardship into proof of weakness. That was why he had left the recordings. That was why he had trusted me to fight. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. Richard leaned closer, his voice low but steady in my ear. "Hold on. We have more." I nodded, though my eyes burned and my body trembled. The tide felt against me, but I knew the fight was not over. Somewhere in Richard's folder was Peter's voice, undeniable and clear, waiting for the moment it would be heard. The sound of the gavel echoed as Judge Robert Miles called the courtroom to order his presence commanding silence. I sat rigid in my chair, hands folded tightly in my lap, forcing myself to breathe evenly while my chest tightened. The polished wood of the bench gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and every creak of the seats behind me reminded me of the people who had come to witness a battle I wished never had to exist. Richard rose first, his voice calm but strong. He told the story clearly without hiding the harsh parts. He explained how I had been forced out of my home by Melissa, how I had survived for weeks in my car, and how Peter, my son, had anticipated this cruelty and created a $5 million trust to ensure I could provide a stable future for Emma and James. His tone never wavered as he pointed out that I now had the means to give them safety, education, and stability. His words felt like a lifeline thrown into dark waters. Judge Miles leaned forward, pen scratching against his notepad as he asked questions. How was the trust managed? Did it provide enough for housing, schooling, health care? Richard answered each one, carefully explaining the structure, the oversight, the clear intention Peter had left behind. I nodded slightly, my heart lifting as I listened. Then Eric Sanders stood. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, his posture confident, his expression practiced. He acknowledged that grief could push people to make desperate decisions, but then he turned his full attention to me, his words slicing into the air. He painted me as a woman adrift, someone who had lived in her car, who had washed up in public restrooms, who had begged for scraps of dignity. He asked the court how such a person could possibly be trusted with 2 grieving children. His voice rang with a rehearsed finality, and each word pressed harder against the fragile shell of my composure. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, shame pressing down as the whispers of the gallery buzzed around me. I wanted to speak, to say that I had survived because of love, because I could not give up, but the words tangled in my throat. I looked down at my hands, gripping them so tightly my nails left marks in my palms. Melissa sat beside him, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her face a mask of sorrow and quiet strength. At moments she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue perfectly timed to match Eric's arguments. To anyone who did not know her, she looked like a grieving widow determined to protect her children. To me, it was a performance, and she played it well. Judge Miles shifted in his chair and turned to Melissa directly. There have been reports, he said slowly, that you are considering relocating out of state, specifically to California. Is this accurate? Melissa blinked, her eyes widening just enough to suggest surprise, but then she recovered. She spoke smoothly, saying she had considered many things in her grief, but had no concrete plans. She insisted that her only goal was to protect her children, to give them the best life possible. Her tone was calm, her words measured, but I saw the small flicker of tension in her jaw. The judge pressed again. Have you or have you not discussed moving with your family members in California? Melissa hesitated just long enough for the silence to grow heavy before she finally admitted she had spoken about it briefly, but only in passing. She assured the court she had no plans at this time. Her lawyer quickly interjected, urging the judge to move on, but I saw the crease in Judge Miles's brow as he made another note. Doubt had crept into the room, and Melissa knew it. Her eyes hardened when she glanced my way. The hearing continued, each side laying down their arguments like cards in a game neither of us could afford to lose. Richard emphasized my bond with Emma and James, how I had been the one raising them in practice, how Peter's trust was designed for this exact purpose. Eric returned again and again to the word unstable, hammering it into the air until it felt like a brand seared into my skin. At last, Judge Miles looked down at the papers before him and then back at the attorneys. He spoke with deliberate gravity. This court has heard testimony and reviewed documents, but there is reference to additional evidence that may be decisive. It has been indicated that Peter Parker left recordings that contain his own words about his children's future. I believe it is time for the court to hear them. The words struck like a sudden crack of thunder. My breath caught my heart pounding so loudly I thought the entire courtroom must hear it. Melissa stiffened her fingers, tightening on her tissue until it tore slightly at the edge. Eric Sanders shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening as if he had not anticipated this turn. Richard gave a small nod, calm but resolute, and began to gather the files and equipment prepared for this very moment. I sat frozen in the room, blurring at the edges, my hands trembling in my lap. After weeks of humiliation and fear, the time had come for Peter's voice to be heard clear and undeniable. The truth he had left behind was about to echo through the walls of the courtroom, and for the first time I felt the tide begin to shift. The bailiff moved quickly, rolling in a small cart with a speaker and setting it on the evidence table. The soft scrape of metal against the polished floor carried through the quiet room like thunder to my ears. Richard leaned forward, checked the connections, then glanced at Judge Miles. The judge gave a firm nod. My chest tightened as Richard pressed the button, and the faint hiss of static filled the courtroom. Peter's voice came through first. Even distorted by the recording, I knew it instantly. His tone was soft but direct, steady, in a way that pulled me straight back to long evenings at the kitchen table when he had confided in me as a boy. In the recording, he asked Melissa what her plans were once he was gone. The words carried sorrow, but also a kind of grim practicality, as if he already suspected what she might say. Melissa's voice followed sharp and cold. She said I was not her responsibility. Then she spoke clearly of her intent to move to California with the children. She used the word start over as if Peter's life could be swept away with fresh paint and new scenery. Gasps rippled through the gallery, whispers rising and then fading under the bailiff's stern look. I pressed my hand hard against the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to keep my eyes forward. For weeks I had known she wanted to erase me, but hearing her say it aloud, captured forever, was like a knife twisting deep. Peter's voice returned slower this time, filled with hurt. He asked, "And what about my mother?" His words cracked just slightly, and hearing that faint tremor broke me. He had been dying, yet he was still thinking of me, still trying to protect me. Melissa's voice answered without hesitation. "She'll figure it out." The cruelty was not in the words themselves, but in the way she said them. Dismissive, final, as if my life and worth meant nothing. The sound rang in the courtroom, leaving the air heavy and tense. I heard someone behind me suck in a breath, another mutter something under their breath. I lowered my head for a moment, unable to hold back the tears that slipped down my cheeks. Across the room, Melissa's face had gone pale. She stared at the speaker as though she could silence it by sheer will. Her hands trembled as she twisted a tissue into shreds. Eric Sanders leaned close to her, whispering urgently, but she gave no sign she could hear him. Judge Miles leaned forward. His expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened. He asked Richard to confirm the source of the recordings. Richard explained clearly that Peter had delivered them months before his passing, that they had been sealed and logged, and that chain of custody had been preserved without error. His voice was calm, factual, and unshakable. The judge turned his gaze to Melissa. "Do you dispute the authenticity of this recording?" His question cut through the silence. Melissa swallowed hard. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally stammered that she had been overwhelmed, that she had not meant what she said, that grief had twisted her words. She tried to smile weakly through her trembling voice, insisting she had loved her husband deeply, and that the court should not take her moment of weakness as truth. But the words on the recording had not sounded like weakness. They had sounded like intent. Eric Sanders rose smoothly, his voice polished as ever. He argued that context was everything, that recordings could not capture the emotional turmoil of those final months. He said people lash out when overwhelmed, and that such words should not define them. His tone carried authority, but as he spoke, I watched the faces in the gallery. Their eyes were not on him. They were on Melissa, their expressions hardened with doubt. I sat rigid, clutching Peter's letter in my bag, feeling his presence more strongly than ever. He had foreseen this exact moment, the way Melissa would spin grief into justification, and he had left proof she could not erase. For the first time, I did not feel voiceless. Peter was speaking for me. Judge Miles tapped his pen lightly against the bench, then spoke slowly, his voice firm. "The court finds the evidence admissible. The statements made in this recording are relevant to the matter of custody." His words landed like a gavel before the gavel. Melissa flinched, her mask of dignity cracking. The judge ordered the recording to continue. More of Peter's voice filled the room. He asked Melissa if she truly believed the children would be better off without me. Melissa responded flatly that she wanted no interference, that she needed to live her own life, that dragging along an old woman would only slow her down. The words echoed in the silence like poison spilled across the floor. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay upright even as each word cut deeper, but beneath the pain was something else: vindication. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. Everyone in that room heard it, clear and undeniable. Melissa shifted uneasily, her hands clutching at Eric's sleeve, but he kept his expression blank. He knew as well as I did that the tide had shifted. When the final segment ended, the courtroom remained hushed. The judge let the silence linger before speaking again. He reminded both parties that the welfare of Emma and James was the sole concern, that Peter's words made clear his intentions, and that the court would weigh them heavily. A murmur spread through the gallery as the judge called a recess. The bailiff barked for order, but the whispers persisted, people shaking their heads, glancing at Melissa with disbelief, some even turning their eyes toward me. For the first time in a long while, those looks did not carry pity. They carried recognition. I sat motionless, my hands trembling, my breath uneven. Tears slipped down silently, not of shame this time, but of release. Peter had spoken, and his voice had shattered the walls Melissa had built around her lies. As the judge left the bench and the gavel echoed, I felt something shift inside me. It was not victory yet, but it was no longer despair. It was the beginning of justice. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he studied the papers before him. The courtroom was silent, each person holding their breath, as if waiting for a thunderclap. I felt my heart pounding so hard it seemed the entire room could hear it. My hands were clasped in my lap, trembling, the paper edges of Peter's letter brushing against my skin like a reminder that he was here even if unseen. Judge Miles cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, including the last will and testament of Peter Parker, the established trust, and the authenticated audio recordings, this court finds sufficient grounds to reassign guardianship of Emma Parker and James Parker. The guardianship will be granted to their grandmother, Mrs. Evelyn Parker. The words landed like a hammer against my chest. For weeks I had prepared myself for disappointment, for some cruel twist that would deny me. But the declaration was real, solid, undeniable. My breath caught in my throat and tears blurred my vision. The judge continued, his voice steady. Furthermore, the $5 million trust fund left by Mr. Peter Parker will be managed for the exclusive benefit of the minors, with Mrs. Parker as the designated guardian. Oversight will be provided to ensure funds are used for the children's health education and welfare. Behind me, I heard murmurs ripple through the gallery. People leaned in close to one another, whispering words I could not make out, but I knew their tone. This was vindication justice. The humiliation I had endured, the cold nights spent curled in the back seat of my car, were now countered by the truth spoken aloud in a court of law. Eric Sanders shot to his feet, his voice rising with urgency. Your Honor, my client is the biological mother. To strip her of primary custody is to strip her of her rights. This is an extraordinary measure. Judge Miles held up a hand, silencing him. Mr. Sanders' biology does not excuse negligence. This court's first obligation is to the welfare of the children. The evidence shows repeated intent by your client to separate them from their grandmother, to relocate them without consideration of their father's wishes, and to deprive them of stability. That is unacceptable. Melissa gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at Eric, her eyes wide, her face drained of color. She began to shake her head, whispering, "No, no, no," over and over, but the judge did not pause. Visitation will be permitted, but only under supervision and limited to a schedule approved by the court. Any attempt to remove the children from the state of Massachusetts will result in immediate suspension of visitation rights. Melissa's composure broke. Tears spilled down her face as she clutched the edge of the table. Her sobs filled the room, but no one moved to comfort her. Eric stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between her and the judge, as though searching for a lifeline that did not exist. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Custody awarded to Mrs. Evelyn Parker. The sound rang out like freedom, like Peter's voice reaching through the veil of death to tell me I was not alone. I lowered my head, closing my eyes, and let the tears fall. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw every night I had spent in the car, every time I had stared at the schoolyard fence to catch a glimpse of Emma and James, every humiliating moment of being treated as disposable. Those days had nearly broken me. Yet here I was, standing not as a victim, but as their protector. I felt a sudden weight against my side. Emma had slipped past the wooden barrier and thrown herself into my arms. Her small body trembled as she pressed her face into my dress, whispering, "Grandma, is it true? We get to stay with you?" I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close, unable to stop my sobs. "Yes, sweetheart. It's true. You're coming home with me." James followed slower, his steps hesitant, but when he reached me, his arms wrapped tightly around my waist. His voice was quiet or guarded. "You promise you won't leave us again?" I pulled back just enough to look at both of them, their tear-streaked faces searching mine for certainty. "Forever," I said. "I will never leave you again." Around us, the courtroom seemed to dissolve. I no longer saw Melissa collapsed in her chair, nor Eric gathering his files with a grim face. All I saw were the two children who carried Peter's smile. Peter's eyes, Peter's hope. And now they were mine to protect, as he had always intended. The bailiff cleared his throat softly, gesturing for us to move. I took each child by the hand, and together we walked out into the hallway. Reporters had begun to gather their cameras, flashing their voices, calling questions. I shielded the children as best I could, moving quickly past the noise. For them, this was not about headlines. It was about finally having a safe place to belong. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp, the Boston sky pale blue above us. Emma lifted her face toward the sunlight and smiled for the first time in weeks. James squeezed my hand, holding it so tightly I felt the strength of his determination. Behind us, I caught sight of Melissa being led out by Eric. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders hunched. She glanced at me once, her expression raw, stripped of pride, and for a fleeting second I saw not the woman who had driven me out, but a mother who realized too late what she had lost. I turned away, focusing on the children. This was not about Melissa anymore. This was about us, about building something new out of the ruins. We climbed into Richard's waiting car. He gave me a small nod, his voice low but steady. "Congratulations, Mrs. Parker. Peter would be proud." I looked at Emma and James, their heads resting against my shoulders, their hands still gripping mine as if afraid to let go. A warmth spread through me, steady and grounding. Peter had given me this chance, this purpose. Now it was mine to carry. As the car pulled away from the courthouse steps, I whispered to the children we're going home, not just to a house, but to a life where love, not fear, would shape our days. And for the first time in a long, long while, I believed it. 6 months later, the chill of winter had faded, and our little house on the edge of Cambridge had filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from the laughter of Emma and James. The neighborhood was quiet and modest, lined with maples that now wore their green coats. Inside, our living room was scattered with crayons, baseball mitts, and framed pictures of Peter that the children had insisted on hanging. His smile looked down at us from the walls, not as a haunting memory, but as a presence that made this house feel like home. James had joined a little league team. Most evenings he practiced throwing against the fence in the backyard, his shouts of excitement echoing through the neighborhood when he managed a clean catch. Emma had taken to covering her bedroom walls with drawings. Bright sun's messy flowers, and a portrait of her father she worked on for days. I let her tape every single one up without worrying about mess or neatness. This was their space, their freedom, and I wanted them to feel it. We cooked meals together, simple dinners that turned into long conversations at the table. Sometimes the children would ask about Peter, what he was like when he was their age, whether he was afraid of thunderstorms, whether he liked pancakes as much as they did. I answered every question honestly, even the hard ones. They deserved to know their father not as a perfect statue, but as a man who loved them with all his imperfections and humor. Life was not perfect. Grief lingered creeping in during quiet moments, but it no longer drowned us. It was a shadow that reminded us of what we had lost, but also of the love that still bound us. One Saturday morning in late spring, as I was planting flowers in the front yard, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I looked up, Melissa was standing there holding a small gift bag in both hands. She looked thinner, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested less time for salons and more time for survival. Her eyes were tired, the practiced sharpness I once knew softened by something raw. I stood slowly wiping my hands on my jeans. Emma and James peeked through the window, their faces tense. Melissa walked up the path, her steps hesitant. She stopped at the porch and held out the bag. "I brought this for Emma. It is her birthday next week. Inside is a necklace with Peter's picture." Her voice cracked on his name. I thought she might want it. I took the bag carefully, studying her face. There was no arrogance there, no condescension, only remorse. She looked at me, tears already gathering. "I was wrong, Evelyn. About everything. I thought I was doing what I needed to survive, but I was selfish. I hurt you and I hurt them. I have lost more than I can bear. Please give me a chance to at least try to be their mother again." For a long moment, I said nothing. Memories of the cold garage, the note I had left for the children, the dumpster filled with Peter's belongings flashed through my mind. But then I thought of Peter, of his letter urging me not just to protect the children, but to guide them with love. "You can see them, Melissa, but it will be supervised. That is what the court ordered, and I will hold to it. If you want to rebuild with them, you will have to earn their trust slowly and gently. I will not let them be hurt again." Her shoulders slumped, but she nodded. "Thank you." As she walked back to her car, I noticed it was not the shiny SUV she once drove, but an older sedan with rust creeping along the edges. I had heard from neighbors that she sold the big house in Belmont, unable to keep up with the mortgage. Life had pressed on her in ways she could not escape. Perhaps that was the only thing that forced her to face herself. That evening, Emma opened the little box and gasped at the necklace. Inside the silver locket was Peter's photo, smiling the same gentle smile that lived in her memory. She asked me to help her put it on, and when the chain clasped around her neck, she held it with both hands and whispered, "Daddy." I kissed the top of her head, whispering that love sometimes found ways to come back, even after mistakes. That night, after the children had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with my journal. The air smelled of fresh grass and lilacs from the neighbor's yard. I wrote about the journey, about Peter's gift, about how $5 million was never just money. It was his way of saying he trusted me, that he believed I could give Emma and James the life they deserved. It was his faith turned into something tangible, something I could use to build a safe, warm world for his children. The porch light flickered gently, moths brushing against it. I closed the journal and looked up at the night sky. I whispered a thank you to Peter, hoping somehow he could hear it. Inside the house, I could hear Emma's laughter as she showed James her new necklace before bed. Their voices were light, unafraid, filled with the kind of childhood Peter would have wanted for them. I leaned back in my chair, letting peace settle into me. For the first time since Peter's funeral, I felt that our lives were not only surviving, but healing. Justice had been served. Love had been restored. Even Melissa, broken and humbled, had a chance to find her way back to the children she had nearly lost. And as I sat there in the quiet of our new life, I thought of the long road behind us and the even longer road ahead. If you have ever witnessed injustice in your family, ask yourself, what would you do to protect the ones you love